Hello everybody, and welcome back once again. My name is Jordan, I'm also known as JMonster. I want to thank you guys for joining me for another Third Age Total War faction breakdown video. Today we're going to be talking about one of our new factions on the alpha build, that being the Guarded Realm of Doriath. For those of you that are a little bit rusty, shall we say, on your Middle-earth history, Doriath was founded by Elwë Singolo, one of the original elves to wake beside the waters of Cuivennen, when the elves were still a very young race, before they ever met the Valar and came over the seas to Valinor. He was, quote-unquote, lost along the way. You can't see my finger quotes, but I'm making them right now. He was lost along the way, where he fell into a trance upon meeting Melian, the Maya, who would later become his spouse, and together they would give birth to Luthien. If it was Baron and Luthien, that would make that part of the story very, very strange indeed. No, indeed, their only child was Luthien, and she would become an important part of a bloodline that would stretch throughout the history of Middle-earth. So the big characters in Doriath, as well as the realm itself, were very significant in the events of the First Age and beyond. The realm of Doriath was located fairly centrally in Beleriand, and Elwë Singolo, otherwise known as Thengol, was the most powerful elf lord in Beleriand. He was the overlord of all Beleriand prior to the coming of the Sindar, and indeed, or the coming of the Noldor, and indeed many of the Noldor would, in some fashion or another, pay homage to him, or at the very least, give him a fairly wide berth. Although some of the Sons of Feanor do get a little bit uppity, but that's neither here nor there. The favored weapon of the Sindar, in general, and not just those of who dwelt in Doriath, is the axe. And that's an important thing to note about Doriath, and why I think it's a very interesting faction for me to discuss, is that it really does bring to the forefront my philosophy when it comes to weapon types and making them unique. And that's, I think, best exemplified in Doriath more so than any other faction that we've released so far. So if we look at the roster here, fairly modest. Their detachment units come down to some supporting units here. So the Spear Host of the Girdle, and I think they've got a Shield Bearer unit as well. So they've only got a couple of detachments, but they're both quite useful supporting units. In particular, the Shield Bearers of Region make an excellent support to the Mounted Company of Region. So that Mounted Company is a melee cavalry unit, which makes them quite powerful against horse units, a little bit against wargs as well, but in particular against horse units. And the Shield Bearers of Region can, of course, be brought for fairly cheap, and you can bring one unit, maybe even two if you'd like, and you can bring them alongside the Mounted Company of Region. So they make an excellent supporting unit, and a nice 1-2 punch there. But as I was saying, so weapon types. There are several different kinds of infantry for Doriath, all of which are high tier. They do have some lower tier units in the form of kind of Wardens of the Girdle, so these are like the out companies of Doriath who would defend the woodland borders. And you got about 3 units of them, and they're all fairly lightly armored. They all have an armor value of 3. Some of them are unshielded. Most of them, in fact, are unshielded. But the majority of their roster are these high tier infantrymen drawn from Region, which is the area that included Menegroth, the capital of Doriath. So a lot of these are going to be regular troops, and the Axe Guard in particular are very good at cutting down chaff units. So orcs tend to have about 5 melee defense. The average unit usually hovers around 5, maybe sometimes 6, depending on weapon type. Spear units will have more, things like that. But in general, very good at hacking down chaff. So lower tier Edain, orcs, as I said, and anything with a lower melee defense value is really going to struggle in the face of the Axe Guard of Region. Really high damage values, as you can see. You can give them an extra 2, although Doriath attack upgrades, rather, are a little bit more expensive. So they've got an extra, I think, 10 gold that you pay for them, so you pay 40 instead of 30, and you can't upgrade any of their armor at all. That being said, their armor value isn't terrible. Most of these high tier units have 8 armor. The Axe-Guard of Region have a little bit less shield than some of the other high tier units, but they more than make up for that. with their very high attack value. Next, we have the Sword Host of Region, and you can see that their attack value is markedly lower. But their melee skill is a good deal higher, and of course their shield is higher as well. So they are a better unit I have found so far for fighting high-skill Elven infantry. Excellent at holding a line for an extended period, and they of course don't have the Spear Malice that units like the Shield Bearers of Region are going to have. So they're a little bit more of a balanced unit, whereas the Axe Guard of Region are more attack focused, and they do give up a fair amount of melee defense and shield as a trade-off for their higher damage. Next, of course, we have the Shield Bearers, which, as I mentioned, come in full strength and detachment size units. And the Shield Bearers have quite low attack indeed, and naturally being a spear unit, they do take a penalty against other infantry. That being said, they have the highest melee skill of the three, and their animation is quite fast, so it does make up somewhat for the attack penalties that they take against anything that isn't cavalry. And of course, being a spear unit, they are very effective against mounted foes. And just to reiterate from earlier, you can bring them in the detachment, and I do highly recommend doing so if you're going to bring some mounted company of Region, especially if you're fighting the Sons of Feanor. Having these shield bearer detachments is going to be what you need to try and tip the balance in your favor, in particular in that cavalry fight. Yes. Next we have the Doriath and Mablung. This is one of the two bodyguard units for Doriath. And both of their bodyguard units are themed after some very important heroes from Doriath during the First Age. In particular, this one is themed after Mablung of the Heavy Hand, who was a mace-wielding, highly ranked elf in Doriath's armies, a very important officer for King Thingol. He would often be sent abroad on important missions. He fought in the Battle of the Nirnaeth Arnothiad, and obviously he survived, and he was later killed at the sack of Menegroth by the dwarves of, I believe it was Belegost. Yes, should be the dwarves of Belegost. This is a two-handed mace unit. They have the highest armor value that Doriath could field, which is 10. They've got quite nice skill there as well with 19, but they are a smaller unit. Really high attack and really devastating charge value. One thing to note about two-handed units in Silmarillion Total War is that they get very high charge values. They get 125% charge value, and the maces have a lower base damage value, and they take a little bit of a melee hit, but not quite as much as a two-handed axe, for example. So they're sort of like the halfway point between a two-handed sword and a two-handed axe, and of course they have that armor piercing as well. This is one of the few frightened units that Doriath can field, so it can be particularly useful for breaking enemy lines. I don't necessarily recommend putting your general in them. You certainly can, and your general will do well for himself with the extra HP that generals tend to have. But I do like to have these units in the thick of things, and there are some other units that you can use for your general, but we'll get into those in just a moment. Next we have the Spear Host of the Girdle, and again they come in full strength and detachment size units. Spear Host is an excellent supporting unit. Not a whole lot of damage behind them, as you can see. They do have really good skill, though, as spear units get significant bonuses to their melee defense, but they have much lower damage, and of course they get a penalty versus infantry units, so it does kind of balance out that way. Very low charge value, and they do have a missile, but it's not an armor-piercing missile, so it's a little bit more like the way throwing axes work in 30s Reforged, but with a bit of a lower damage value, and that's partially because defense values on shield and armor are quite low in Silmarillion compared to, say, 30s Reforged, which I think a lot of people use as a frame of reference when trying to contextualize a lot of the changes that have been made in Silmarillion Total War. So this 6 missile, regardless of the fact that it does not have AP, is quite useful against units with low shield or no shield or lower armor. So it can be very powerful, and of course you can bring these units en masse. You can bring 3 of them, and then you can bring 2 additional ones as detachments. So you can have a lot of mid-range javelin fire as a Doriath, but of course it's not going to be as effective as some other javelin units. Next we have the Wardens of the Girdle. These archers are armed with poison arrows and a one-handed axe in close quarter. quarters. Although I think we are thinking about making them dual wielding, which will give them a little bit more melee defense and a little bit higher damage, so that they're at the moment they're very, very fragile in melee, which I want to maintain, but I don't want them to be quite so fragile as they are. So moving forward, they may end up with 2 axes, just for the sake of the longevity of this video. That is something to be aware of. That might be a change that gets made in the future. But good range, decent enough ammunition, and of course they have the morale debuff that comes with the poison arrows. So a useful supporting unit, as many of the girdle units are. Next, we have the Warriors of Region. They are a 2-handed axe unit, very high attack and defense values. You can see that they're quite low on melee skill, which makes them particularly vulnerable to high damage units, or units that, or Lancers, for example. Lancers can be very deadly to a unit with 9 melee skill, as many Lancers tend to, even though the kind of mid-tier Lancers here, the Outriders of the Girdle, this is a charge value that you're going to see pretty well across the board, and that's going to be matching 16 charge damage against 9 melee defense, and that's pretty nasty. So these guys are very vulnerable to cavalry charges, of course vulnerable to missiles, but if you can get them into close quarters, and they're pretty capable of doing that with 1.15 speed, then they are an absolute terror. In my opinion, based on the replays I've seen so far, this is a must-have unit against certain factions like Angband, for example, or against the Sons of Feanor, who have lower melee defense values, which makes them more vulnerable to the AP trait on this unit. Next, we have the Marksmen of Region. Probably sensing a pattern here. A lot of these units are regulars that would be drawn from the capital city of Doriath, and these guys are armed with Silverthorn arrows, which potentially people are a little bit unfamiliar with them. It is a new projectile that I created for Reforged .97, and I've brought that over to Silmarillion Total War. So an excellent disruption tool. They don't have a ton of ammunition, but there are a good deal more of them, so it kind of works out. 80 of them firing 8 arrows is actually quite significant, and it's a very useful disruption tool, and you can use that to break up enemy lines a little bit, and allow your axe guard to get in close, or you can potentially use focus fire to pin an entire unit in place. And mixed front lines, still very common in Silmarillion Total War because of how effective they are, so you're going to get that kind of like bleed over. So if there's 2 units stacked on top of each other, you're going to be able to paralyze an entire flank with these 2 units. So there's a lot of tactical options with the Marksmen of Region outside of their missile damage, which is pretty decent for Silmarillion Total War. Missiles are a little bit less powerful, at least the bow missiles are a little bit less powerful, but the added utility of those high mass projectiles does add a lot to this unit. So potentially very, very strong. Not necessarily something that you want to bring to try and win a skirmish fight, but there's other units that you can bring, in particular the Wardens of the Girdle, that can be useful in that regard. Next, we have the Kuthalim, which is named after the Sindar hero Beleg Kuthalion, I believe. So Beleg Strongbow. And these guys are the strong bows. They are armor-piercing archers, as Doriath doesn't really have a ton of options to deal with some very large, heavily armored monsters, or the knight units from the Sons of Feanor, for example. This unit can provide them with a little bit of an answer to those particularly problematic questions. So they have very limited ammunition, and their missile damage isn't ginormous, but it does help a lot. They are quite effective, especially against armored foes, which is what you want to use them against anyway. And then in close quarters, a very powerful unit. So 30 attack on them, as they are quite small with 30 men in the unit. Their armor is a little bit lower, but their melee defense is very, very high indeed. So trying to charge these guys down with cavalry, not usually going to work out terribly well for you unless you've got, say, the knight unit from the Sons of Feanor. Do you have a chance of dealing some serious damage, or if you charge them from behind, that can be particularly devastating. But yeah, 30 attack, a decent enough charge value, not quite as high as dedicated shock infantry. They can use stakes, very long range missiles with 180, a really, really nice unit. Next, then we get into the limited cavalry roster from the Realm of Doriath. We have the Outriders of the Girdle. They're ambushed Lancer cavalry, so they can hide anywhere, but they're very, very fragile. So if you look at their armor and their skill there, quite easy to get these units destroyed. That being said, it is important to note that Lancers are not utterly hopeless in combat with other cavalry units, but specifically warg units. So they do have a bonus against wargs, which is great for them, but against horsemen, these guys will fall apart very quickly. So keep them away from melee cavalry. And of course, with only 6 melee defense, even wargs can chew them out quickly. But you know, they do have a little bit of a bonus against them. Next, we have the Mounted Company of Region. Very nicely armored unit here. Good melee skill. A little bit lower shield value than... actually, they've got a little bit of a higher shield value than the Ascot of Region, who share the same shield with them. But yeah, really effective unit. Not a lot of numbers, though. They are quite elite, and they can hold a line, but they're really just there to entangle units, and when you use them in tandem with the Shield Bearers of Region, that's when they can become a real threat to cavalry. That being said, they're not awful. Next, we have the Ballista and the Catapult. Only the Noldor factions will have access to the Trebuchet, but pretty well most of the Elven factions, or at least the industrial ones, are going to have access to a catapult. I believe the Elves of Osirian, who we haven't covered yet, only have access to a ballista, which does kind of pose some problems for them in terms of assaulting city, but that's a tough thing for the Elves of Osirian to do in any case, because they are quite vulnerable to things like missiles. But that's neither here nor there. That is the Realm of Doriath. Really, really good faction so far. You'll see a little bit more, but a lot of our testers have chimed in and told me that it's probably one of the strongest factions that we have in the mod right now. I do have several replays I'd like to show you about these guys, and that'll be coming in the very, very near future. So, my name is Jordan, also known as JMonster. I hope you guys have enjoyed this so far, and I'll see you next time. Take care, everybody.